To tonight's lecture. I'm Nani Shivers, an intern with the Lou Douglas Lecture Program. University for Mankind began the Lou Douglas Lecture Series in 1980 to honor the memory of Lou Douglas, a man widely respected for his accomplishments and contributions to our university. At this time, we'd like to recognize Mary Douglas, the wife of Lou Douglas. If you would please stand. The Lou Douglas Lecture Series would not be successful if it weren't for the dedication and support of the Lecture Committee. Would all committee members who are present please stand? I would like to remind everyone that Monday at 7:30, a week from today here in Forum Hall, Ama Ata Adu will conclude this year's series by discussing the images of Africa at century's end. Also, following the question and answer period with Dr. Nanda, there will be a reception in the lobby that's open for everyone. It is now with pleasure that I introduce Dr. William Richter, Professor of Political Science and Interim Assistant Provost for International Programs at Kansas State University. He has served as head of the KSU Department of Political Science, director of the South Asia Center, and chair of the Landon Lecture Series. Many of his scholarly publications focus on political and security issues in South Asia. He recently returned from Pakistan, where he observed the national and provincial elections as a member of the National Democratic Institute International Observer Delegation. Dr. Richter.
Those of us who knew Lou Douglas as a friend and colleague are glad that this lecture series has continued over the years to bring to our campus and to our community speakers who have enlightened us on a wide range of public issues, with a special focus on peace, justice, equity, and other issues which Lou held firmly throughout his life and sought throughout his life to help make a reality. Tonight's speaker is an excellent choice to carry on that tradition. Professor Ved P. Nanda is director of the International Legal Studies program at the University of Denver College of Law. He also holds the titles of Thompson G. Marsh Professor of Law since 1987 and John Evans University Professor since 1992. He also serves as Associate Provost for Internationalization of the University of Denver. He is Vice President of the World Jurist Association, President of the World Association of Law Professors, and a member of numerous professional and human rights boards and commissions. And it's as a member of one of those boards and commissions, that is the National Board of the United Nations Association, that he and Rosales Rieger of Manhattan have been in touch, and I believe that's one of the linkages which helped to bring him to this lecture series. I'd like to mention, if I may take just a moment for a footnote to that the local United Nations Association, the Flint Hills chapter of UNA USA, co-sponsors with the Political Science Department each year an essay contest that is nationally sponsored by the United Nations Association. Any of you who are high school students or who know high school students who are interested in the United Nations might be interested in participating in that essay contest. This year the topic is an agenda for peace, and I would guess that you can get the first part of your preparation for addressing that as you listen to the speaker this evening. Professor Nanda received his BA and MA degrees from Punjab University in India and his bachelor's and master's degrees in law from Delhi University. He also holds a Master of Laws degree from Northwestern University School of Law. In addition to Denver University, where he's taught since 1965, he's been Distinguished Visiting Professor or Scholar at the University of Hawaii, University of San Diego, University of Iowa, and elsewhere, and at international law institutes abroad in Dublin, Mexico City, Oxford, and Paris. Among Professor Nanda's many honors is the 1990 World Legal Scholar Award from the World Peace Through Law Center, and the 1985 International Excellence Award from the Colorado Council for International Organizations. Professor Nanda is also a very prolific scholar on a wide range of international legal topics. Two recent titles of the more than a dozen books he has authored, co-authored, or co-edited are Europe, Community Law After 1992, A Practical Guide for Lawyers Outside the Common Market, and World Debt and the Human Condition, Structural Adjustment and the Right to Development. His articles, book chapters, and professional papers, numbering well over 100, also demonstrate the broad scope of his interests and expertise, with topics on the environment, humanitarian intervention, nuclear weapons, refugees, human rights, and conflict in virtually every part of the world. This evening, Professor Nanda will address us on the topic, Ethnic Conflicts in World Order.
Thank you very much, Professor Richter. I'm delighted, honored to be here. I haven't heard the pronunciation of my name so proper as today. After many, many years, I don't know how to pronounce it right either. But thank you. I am grateful to the kind hospitality of two couples, Rosie and Les Rieger, and Gloria and Clary Ramsey. I did not have the privilege of knowing Professor Lou Douglas. I knew his name, but after coming here, talking with people, I feel as if I know him. And Mary Douglas, I'm deeply honored that you have graced this place today and that you are present. I wish that Lou Douglas were here, and I wish that instead of me, he was talking about this topic today, because the topic is such concern to him that he would have been the most eminent person appropriate to talk about the topic. The topic is ethnic conflicts and new world order. I thought I would give you the conclusions first, so that you can go back to chiefs and peckers if you so desire. Well, not many of you seem that interested, so I think I'll talk then. Remember the days not long ago of the fall of Berlin Wall? You recall probably the new dawn of democracy in Central Eastern Europe. You recall Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and those kind of heady days. And that was not long ago. But it seems so different, just in very few years. And you remember, as the end of the Cold War became a reality, we were all kind of euphoric. And it was not simply President Bush who coined the word the New World Order, but we were all hoping that the end of that Cold War would probably bring an era of prosperity, and that perhaps we'll find durable and lasting and enduring peace in the world. And then all of a sudden things have changed. And we find this to be a pretty disorderly world. What was termed as a new world order does not seem to hold that kind of promise for a lasting peace. There are a lot of questions, a great deal of uncertainty. Certainly there is change, but not necessarily order at the present time. The world is engulfed in all kinds of conflicts, many of them with ethnic conditions attached to it, ethnic undertones, and many of them are at the present time causing, if not a breach of international peace or act of aggression, certainly at the present time a threat to international peace and security that the United Nations Charter said that the world community ought to respond to. The very first question that I'll ask is, what is an ethnic conflict? And perhaps in this hall, there are a number of you who have done more work than I have on what ethnic conflicts means. I would use a very simple way of defining an ethnic conflict, and my rule of thumb would be that the term ethnic conflict is warranted in a conflict at any level. It could be political, social, military, in which the contending actors or parties identify themselves to each other in ethnic terms. This is that they use ethnic criteria. And there are a number of people who have done much more work than I have that would tell us that any or several of the following terms might be used in order to determine ethnicity or ethnic conflicts in that sense. Language, religion, nationality, culture. And there are plenty of examples. Hindus and Muslims in India, Basques and Spaniards, Tamils and Sinhalese, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. We've been hearing last few days in Burundi about Tutsis and Hutus, Europeans and Africans in South Africa, blacks and Indians in Guyana. Bosnia, we are familiar with Serbs, Croats, Muslims. We have been hearing in the last couple of days, more than before, about Abkhazians, Georgians, Armenians, Azeris, Turks, Kurds, Jews, Palestinians, and I could go on, and you know as many different varieties as I do. We have to ask ourselves a question that even if the major issue is not ethnic in the conflict itself, it may be economic, it may be political, but if there are undertones that are ethnic, do we call it an ethnic conflict? Because when Kurdish identity is repressed by the Turkish and Iraqi governments, at that time what's really at stake is the concept of the nation state as it is seen by the governing elites. It is not ethnic incompatibility that is probably the reason for that. People have asked all kinds of questions as to why ethnic conflicts occur. How do we account for them? There are a number of theories, but that's a topic for tomorrow. Tonight I won't go into any theories about the ethnic phenomenon. I think the challenge for us remains as to why, how, and when common economic and political conflicts, they turn into ethnic conflicts. And then I think we need to ask a question. How do we as the world community address those ethnic conflicts? And here let me at least give you part of my conclusions first. I feel very strongly that the United States at this stage is not to be and cannot be the world's policeman. Rosie tells me that I should not use terms that are sexist. Police persons. But we cannot be. And if the United States cannot do it, who ought to be the one to address those ethnic conflict questions? And here my conclusion would be that at this stage, the only game in town that we have is the United Nations Charter, that we ought to look into the United Nations Charter carefully, that there are regional organizations, the Organization of African Unity, Organization of American States, there is the European Community, there are regional organizations in Asia, ASEAN and others. And maybe these regional organizations, along with the United Nations, ought to be able to address these kind of questions. What is the art of the possible? How should the United Nations address these conflicts? And then here my conclusion would be that I would draw upon by looking at various issues. I'll start with state sovereignty, a concept that we grew up in, a concept that goes back many centuries, a concept that is being eroded, and appropriately so. But still, state sovereignty is going to be a very powerful concept, remains so. So state sovereignty on the one hand, and then self-determination and other kind of items that we have heard pertaining to human rights of groups and individuals, and the clash between the two, and the tension between the two, and who succeeds. How do we at the present time, looking at the world arena and finding what people have said, that there is simultaneously a push, a move toward globalization and regionalization, but at the same time tribalization, integration and disintegration, and on that push and pull on all sides. What's going to win out of those two? We can speculate today, but after looking at all those, I'll conclude that at the present time the focus ought not to be simply on enforcement, peace enforcement, use of force, but that perhaps the time has come for us to think about refining the concepts of peacekeeping, refining the concept of peacemaking, refining the concept of peace building, and more than ever before, to focus on preventive diplomacy as a means to resolve conflicts, disputes really before they become conflicts. And here I would suggest to you that as universities, as church groups, as the United Nations Association and League of Women Voters, as part of this great mass of humanity that has the opportunity and that does to involve ourselves in different community groups, that as non-governmental organizations, we need to play a much more active role in that preventive diplomacy part. So that's really what I want to do in the next about 20 minutes, and then I like to hear from you, and I like to have you also make any number of comments. Let me then begin by saying that as there are new issues, as there are new actors, as there are new challenges in this new international arena, new relationships that are radically altering traditional concepts of sovereignty. Sovereignty is in transition. Sovereignty is in decline. Well, what is sovereignty? It has been defined, as you know, as a supreme authority in a political community. Sovereignty is about power. It carries connotations of autonomy and freedom from external control. It became the cornerstone of the modern nation-state system. The concept has assumed, at one time had assumed, the nature of absoluteness about it. Sovereign nations regulated trade. They controlled immigration and emigration. Who entered into a nation-state even today? On what terms is that nation-state's prerogative? Nation-states have entered into interstate relations, entered into treaties, international agreements. They have had complete jurisdiction within their own territories. And our laws reflect that very simple notion that jurisdiction is totally, exclusively within the national boundaries with the nation-state as such. And as you know, British view of a sovereign to have dominion over its territory is reflected today in our own Anglo-American jurisprudence in American laws. Nation-states have controlled their domestic affairs. About 100 years ago, some erosion started occurring in sovereignty. And I won't take you through it in detail, but you recall that League of Nations, before that permanent court of arbitration, some international organizations in embryonic stages began developing. And finally came the United Nations. And under treaties, voluntarily nation-states have parted with their sovereignty. But the United Nations Charter, as you may recall, it starts off by saying, we the peoples, and it talks about the peoples to assume responsibility to prevent wars. But then the entire framework of the UN Charter is a framework of national sovereignty, territorial integrity. That is the basis of the United Nations Charter. United Nations Charter legitimizes sovereignty, and sovereignty is going to stay as a major element in our own lifetime. I don't mean to tell you that sovereignty's erosion means that nation state is at the end of the road. But certainly nation state has competing entities challenging it. These are international organizations. These are international non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, human rights groups. And today, for the first time, I won't dwell on it, I won't talk a whole lot about it, but I'll probably mention it a couple of places. Indigenous groups that all over the world, and this is in 1993, the year of the indigenous peoples, they have been claiming that they also have a stake in that power. They have never accepted state sovereignty. And how does that sovereignty relate to them? And they are asking those questions. So while sovereignty is facing major erosion today, both from international actors and internal actors, and you can probably say that the reason seems obvious, and today I'm not going to go into the reasons, but you understand that as we look up in the sky and find in the southern hemisphere ozone depletion reaching a critical stage, as in North Sea area, countries around the North Sea had seen it become a sewer. As people know about the oceans dying, as the population seems exploding, and all of a sudden you realize that no one country can conceivably address effectively any of those problems that are global in nature. We recognized in 1992 in Rio at the Earth Summit that international environmental issues are not the ones that nation states singly or even in a region can address effectively. We recognized in Vienna this June that human rights issues are not the ones that any longer can remain simply the predominant concern of the nation-state entity. When erosion of those human rights, deprivation of human rights, violation of human rights, massive violation of human rights occurs, no longer can a nation-state simply say, events are occurring within our own country. The world community cannot intervene in our own internal affairs. Pol Pot said that. And the world community helplessly watched 1 million people in Cambodia die because of that genocidal act. Idi Amin said that, and the world community helplessly again observed massive violations of human rights. But I think it was realized by the world community that that ought not to be so, that that cannot continue, that a nation state cannot use sovereignty in that sense of demanding that no matter what happens within it, no matter how it treats its own citizens, that the world community cannot and must not intervene, because on legal grounds, technical grounds, more than that, legalistic grounds, that the United Nations Charter in Article 2, paragraph 7 says that any intervention in internal affairs is prohibited. I think I need to probably quickly move on. Let me simply state here that nation state still has considerable power, although that power is on the wane. Sovereignty has to be seen then today as a relative concept, although in many third world countries, sovereignty is a relatively new experience and people are unwilling to part with it. The United Nations' impact on sovereignty has been considerable. And here I would begin then to tie ethnic conflicts to international responses. Not that internationally we have responded to all ethnic conflicts, but under the United Nations Charter, there is sufficient leeway for the international community to act. It can act when ethnic conflict threatens international peace and security. You recall that's what happened in the Kurd issue, on the Kurdish issue. The Security Council did tell to Saddam Hussein, you cannot kill with impunity the way massacre without any international response the way you have done the Kurds in the past. Security Council did say to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein, that Shiites in the south, you cannot simply kill them because they are within your own territory. That this is kind of an ethnic conflict and you can take care of those Kurds in any way you please. But still, the United Nations has not acted in every civil war. You remember many internal conflicts with ethnic elements that they have not been responded to. United Nations has been selective. In some instances, for example, Burundi, despite the various signals suggesting that a dormant and latent conflict there would ignite any time, no effective preventive measures were ever taken. Instances abound. Burma, Liberia, notwithstanding a delayed and a rather ineffectual African response by ECOWAS, this is the Economic Community of Western African Nations, and the Sudan, to name a few. Well, what conclusions can be drawn? In Iraq, the United Nations action to protect the Kurds became a reality only after the Gulf War, when the major powers found it in their interest to do so. There still remains no consensus at the United Nations that a response to massive violations of human rights would result necessarily in humanitarian military intervention. And as I said, I don't want to focus on the military intervention part, but as a last resort, the goons in Haiti, what has happened in many other parts where you find that nation states no longer even exist as a nation state. It's total anarchy. I think you probably can even argue that it's not simply a right to intervene, but perhaps it's a duty at times to intervene. And I will not spend a whole lot of time on humanitarian assistance, because in Eritrea, in the Sudan, in many other parts of the world, if nation state is using food as a weapon, if nation state is not even permitting food to reach people who need it and who are starving, I think we've got to ask a question. Is there any responsibility on the part of the international community to see that food as a weapon is not used? That people who are needy, who are starving or famished, ought to be at least provided food aid? And then that's the kind of issue that in the last couple of years has concerned the United Nations. United Nations has, in some resolutions, both in the Security Council, in General Assembly, said that not very clearly, not very precisely, not unambiguously at this present time, that people in need of humanitarian assistance have a right to get it. But I think impliedly, we are at the present time moving in that direction. When the question of intervention comes in an ethnic conflict, the question is, who is to intervene? When is the intervention appropriate? How is it to be done? And if it is going to be the use of force, then customary international law demands that the twin criteria be met, and that is necessity and proportionality. Why intervention is going to take place? I think here the reason would be massive violations of human rights, of genocidal proportion. Once that happens, then you can probably say that the use of force as a last resort is permissible, but that use of force has to be proportional to the need and to the risk to the lives. One question that often I think you have faced is that of self-determination. That's a slogan, that's a term that has been used time and time again. During the era of colonialism, it was said that people under alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation have a right to demand that they have control over both their internal and external destinies. That if they want to be free, they ought to be free. And most of the time, self-determination then is called a principle or a right or aspiration or objective or goal of peoples to determine their own fate. The question really is it a legal right? Is it enforceable? Does it permit an ethnic group then to demand secession, to get out of a country's clause and to say we need to begin our own life as an independent entity? Do all peoples have a right to self-determination? Do, for example, indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination? Do Kurds have a right to self-determination? Well, who are these peoples? How do you define them? Do you define them because of language, because of religion, because of culture? Is there a link between self-determination and democracy? And I must tell you that the old thinking about self-determination simply being the right to secede and right to be an independent entity, that ought to be rethought. And in the rethinking process today, we probably have to say that self-determination does not simply mean secession. Self-determination could be meant that you can have free association as a group with an independent state. Or self-determination could mean that a group of people or peoples could integrate within a nation state. Next few years are going to demand that we creatively think about the entire question of self-determination. It has become, on the one hand, a slogan for peoples demanding the right to be free. And on the other hand, after the era of colonialism came to an end, those who have become independent, they simply have been saying, this is a club in which once you enter, you don't want anyone else to enter that club. It is exclusive membership. You are in, you want to keep everyone else out. But I don't think that we need to look at self-determination as simply a right to secede. On indigenous peoples who are going to be demanding that they have a right of self-determination in many different parts of the world, I simply want to mention here that their right to self-determination does not mean that they need simply to be independent and they need to secede from the country that they are in. Because at the present time, there is a whole lot of work going on the right of the indigenous peoples. There is presently a draft declaration. There is a working group under the United Nations auspices in Geneva. It has been working for a long time. The International Labour Organization has been working for a long time. The World Bank has its own directives. And on all counts, I think the point today can be made that among, obviously you don't count indigenous peoples as ethnic groups, or perhaps you can, but obviously they are within a nation state. Obviously when state sovereignty is being eroded, and when people are clamoring for their own right to decide their own destiny, just like ethnic groups, there is going to be an issue that they also have a right to decide their own fate. I am not going to spend a whole lot of time on humanitarian intervention. because humanitarian intervention, whether the United Nations can undertake it as a last resort, whether each country can undertake it, let's leave that issue aside. For the next 5 minutes, and I'll take just about 5 to 10 minutes, I'd like to talk about the United Nations response then to these ethnic conflicts. Secretary General of the United Nations, as Professor Richter said, in 1992, he, in the summer, provided a blueprint that was called an Agenda for Peace. He recognized in that report that there are going to be all kinds of conflicts based upon ethnic, national, religious grounds, conflicts that used to be between or among nation states, that these conflicts are going to be within nation states, internal conflicts. And he said that they are going to threaten international peace and security. And then he responded and he said, United Nations ought to be able to take some action in order to see that those conflicts do not get out of hand. This past summer, a year later, he submitted another report on the implementation of the recommendations that were contained in the Agenda for Peace. And in this report, he talks about 4 specific things: preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace enforcement, actually 5 things, and peace building. And let me very quickly touch upon all of them. What is preventive diplomacy? It used to be a pretty elusive concept, but today it has got some flesh to it. It is effort to resolve disputes before violence breaks out. It's action to prevent disputes from arising between parties, to prevent existing disputes from escalating into conflicts, to prevent the spread of conflicts after they occur. And you recall, it's fact-finding, it's goodwill missions, it's good offices of the Secretary General, it's mediation, it is conciliation, it's coaxing the parties to negotiate. All that is, at the present time, preventive diplomacy. And under preventive diplomacy, in the last simply 1 year, between August 1992 and July 1993, the Secretary General himself, the United Nations, was involved in 100 such missions. Secretary General himself took 27 of those missions abroad, and he sent special envoys. And the difficulty with this kind of thing is that if these preventive measures do not succeed, then there's a drama on the world stage. Everybody knows about them. If they are successful, you can't talk about them a whole lot. But preventive diplomacy is an important, very important step in the future to deal even with ethnic conflicts. Second would be peacemaking. I'll come to peacekeeping in a minute. Peacemaking is action to bring hostile parties to agreement through peaceful means. And here the effort is to halt conflicts and preserve peace once it has been attained. Peacekeeping, the United Nations invented it. You remember peacekeepers got a Nobel Peace Prize at one time. At the present time, there are 17 missions, 80,000 plus people. By the end of this year, there might be more than 100,000 peacekeepers. There used to be those blue helmets. We heard about them. They simply would not use force. They were there between warring factions to provide a buffer, to keep those warring factions out. It would not resolve any conflict by peacekeeping means, but the effort was to provide that kind of breathing space within which political, economic, social, all kind of efforts can be made to patch up differences, to find a package deal, to find political settlement to become a reality. There was always consent by the parties, cooperation of the parties. And today, we've gone beyond the traditional peacekeeping efforts, because today is protecting humanitarian aid and convoys. It is supervision of elections. It is monitoring human rights. It's keeping apart the warring factions, but much more than that. Because you remember that in Cambodia, the United Nations did internal peace and order maintenance of that. It provided police. It provided administrative machinery. It held elections. In Namibia, it helped creating a constitution. Again, it provided law and order and new regime until it came into place. The United Nations was the one which was responsible for creating that kind of climate. Close to home in El Salvador, you recall that the United Nations is the one responsible for bringing the parties together, brokering a peace, and finding that, you remember, a mission was sent to find the truth as to what kind of violations had occurred during the Civil War era. Somalia, former Yugoslavia, today we find difficulty in those countries. We find difficulty in Haiti. And I think, again, the question has really come up for us. When can the United Nations undertake these kind of actions? Peace enforcement is when the United Nations can use force. Sky is the limit under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. And in the United Nations setting, since the United Nations came into being, you recall that there have been just two such actions, Korea, and then in the use of force against Saddam Hussein. But when the need be, the Security Council can act. And as I said, sky is the limit. Any kind of action can be taken by the United Nations. Let me mention peace building, and I'll conclude by talking about what can the United Nations do, what are the limits, because today those limits are apparent. And even President Clinton had said that the United Nations cannot undertake all kinds of operations. When there are ethnic conflicts, United Nations cannot go in. There are going to be simply selective areas where the United Nations can intervene. So peace building would be action to identify and support structures that are designed to strengthen and solidify peace. The purpose is here to avert a relapse into conflict. For example, repair the society, restore the civil society, mine clearing, electoral assistance, disarmament. These are the kind of actions. And then humanitarian relief that the United Nations has done in time of drought, man-made and natural disasters, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees with all that refugee work. So let me conclude. Ethnic conflicts, challenging international peace, tearing apart many societies. No nation alone can intervene. Collectively, United Nations or some kind of multilateral assistance would be needed. And as President Clinton said the other day, he said if the United States is to participate in those peacekeeping operations, the United Nations must be able to say no. And the Secretary General agreed. But remember, the United States is the one that sits in the Security Council as one of the 5 permanent members. The United States has got to give blessings to every action that the United Nations undertakes. The United Nations is being called upon to undertake many of those peacekeeping operations. Well, when should the United Nations act? And here I would suggest to you that perhaps it is appropriate that the mandate of those United Nations peacekeeping operations be very clearly defined. It is appropriate that perhaps the United Nations has at its command some rapid deployment forces that countries have given the United Nations in order to use them when the United Nations needs them. We need to remember that for 45 years, during all this period of Cold War, when those shadows kind of descended at the very beginning of the United Nations, and that period of honeymoon between the United States and the Soviet Union did not last very long. And those shadows kind of lingered for all these 45 years. During all that period, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union wanted to see a United Nations that was strong. We did not give it the capacity. We did not permit its effectiveness. And so without effectiveness, without capacity, today there is a United Nations that we all want to have undertake all these peacekeeping operations. So we've got to strengthen it. Along with strengthening the United Nations, a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, there are all kinds of effectiveness mechanisms that need to be taken to give the United Nations capacity. Remember, we've been hearing in the past few days that the United States is not going to give the United Nations any command and control over its own troops. And the reasons are logistics, different kind of ways that we in our own Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marines have our own structures, and they at times are not compatible with others. And United Nations doesn't have the capacity. So I think the answer is to build that capacity, to give it the effectiveness. And let me conclude then by saying that as I talked about preventive diplomacy, President Carter has, through his center, assumed that kind of responsibility of getting eminent people to go in, bring parties together, make an effort. At times those efforts succeed, at times they don't. But I think non-governmental organizations have a great deal of responsibility in providing that kind of assistance, because I would not leave the entire thing to governments. There is a parallel track with governmental operations in bringing about peace, and I think in these humanitarian efforts, there is absolutely no reason that non-governmental organizations cannot play an important role. So in the days to come, ethnic conflicts are still going to tear international society. We still don't know if in the days to come the success is going to be toward globalization or further tribalization. We do know that the United States alone cannot police the world. And we do know that when egregious violations of human rights occur in any country, as we found out in the Second World War, that violation of human rights and international anarchy, they are interrelated. That Hitler was not simply killing Jews, he was also challenging international peace and security. So that intertwining of human rights violations and international peace and security is there, it's evident. And therefore I think we need to see that the United Nations becomes more effective. It is in the interest of the United States, and we need to see that non-governmental organizations play a more important role in preventive diplomacy. The future lies in that preventive diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Professor Nanda, we thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. Those of us, all of us, have lived through the last 5 years and have seen the tremendous changes that have occurred, but you've put it into a context which helps to understand it and laid out an agenda for the future that we very much appreciate. We have time for questions. Let me urge that you keep your questions brief and proceed to ask them. I'll call you back to conclusion after several questions have been asked.
In Bosnia, and what I'm wondering is how would you describe, from the standpoint of the framework you've outlined, the determination of the government of England, and this country is going along with it here, to adopt the position that the Muslim forces there ought not to be allowed to receive weapons under a general arms embargo, because that would just be to increase the killing. The counterposition is, of course, that the present policy is simply preventing these people from defending themselves when no one else is willing to step in to defend them. And if one is not willing to take the other kind of intervention that you outlined in one part of your framework, what should be our judgment about this particular part of that policy?
Bosnia is a disgrace. It shows utter bankruptcy of European powers. I ought not to be that harsh, but I need to be. Bosnia has reached a stage where at this stage I don't know what action would be appropriate. And as you rightly pointed out, whether we arm them or not, at this stage I don't really know that the solution is simply in arming Muslims. I totally understand and appreciate, and I would be in that position a few months ago. It's not Muslims' fault that they were not armed at that time. But today I'm not sure militarily if that would be the most appropriate thing even for them. Well, what's the answer then? And then even under my framework, at this stage, is there a right to intervene in Bosnia? Answer is yes. Is there a duty to intervene? The answer is yes. Is anybody going to intervene? The answer is no.
How about this?
There is no political will at the present time in the international community to intervene in that part. Closest we have come to that is to have a War Crimes Commission and now a War Crimes Court, but War Crimes Commission and War Crimes Court cannot alone resolve that kind of problem or answer.
I guess my question has to do with, more specifically, I agree with what you say, but more specifically here, it seems to me that the question is whether we think it's in the interest of Bosnians to be able to arm themselves or not. Isn't it really their right to decide that? And shouldn't we be standing aside, and if we're not going to arm them, allow themselves to get armed somewhere?
Right, but here the point simply would be that that action has to be taken by the Security Council, where both England and France have their veto. And the other day I was simply talking about the Security Council to be changed and adding some more members, but neither Britain nor France would agree to it. And the United States alone, even if it said that we do not believe that England or France, you're right, you remember that the Security Council cannot function, cannot act legitimately, cannot take any action without the veto power not being used. And England and France had very unequivocally said that they were going to use their veto in order for the Security Council not to be able to take that action.
Just allow me to follow that up one piece here. It seems to me, though, that if people decide that they're not, the embargo has to be enforced or not. And for the embargo to be able to garner the forces that it needs to enforce it, to be enforced, you also have to have another Security Council vote. And there you've got 5 again, and all you've got to have is 1 veto. Why can't the United States, for instance, be that veto? In other words, they can have this call out here, but if they're not going to enforce it, if they can't enforce it, then what's it mean? And why should it be allowed to be enforced if it's that flagrantly wrong?
Yeah, I think again you're raising a good question. I don't have the answer to it, and the reason, as you know better than I do, that Washington has got to work with London, and Washington has got to work with Paris, in NATO, in other areas. So the point that I'm simply saying is that Washington has made a decision that it's in its own self-interest not to take that stand at the present time. Should it take that moral stand? I think I'll probably go along with you. But is the United States going to take that stand? And the answer is no. And it's going to be geopolitical considerations and foreign policy decisions that Washington is going to take at the present time. And it's I think, very clear to us that on peacekeeping, peace enforcement in any number of areas, no nation state is going to act unless it sees that kind of action to be in its own self-interest.
Yes, sir. As a student of political science, under your plan here you had preventive diplomacy. As a learning experience here of the Yugoslavia situation, what would you have seen the UN do to prevent the problems that we now see in that area, and what could we do in the future?
Very good. I think that was the time when European community could have acted. Now I can go back and say that perhaps it was a very hasty decision to ask Slovenia and Croatia to become independent. I talked about self-determination. Those countries wanted to be independent, but maybe the timing was not right. Because immediately when they became independent, then Serbs in Bosnia, Croats in Bosnia, they made claims that they want to be independent in Bosnia too. And so I think from the very beginning, efforts either to make that a pluralistic society, to find some kind of confederation, to make an attempt to see that these parties, they did not have to love each other. There was not going to be a love-in, but they could coexist. They had coexisted. And perhaps devolution of power, economic reforms, some kind of incentives could have been used at that time, which obviously were not. But that is simply being a Monday morning quarterbacking, and I can certainly stand here and say that. But in this instance, I can say that because I did write those articles in my own Denver Post saying that that ought to be done. And I'm sure that I was not the only one. There were many who could see that happen, and nothing was done. And at the present time, Burundi is a pretty good example. We have seen that calamity ready to occur, and nobody did anything to do that. I do not want to sound that kind of either despondent or totally pessimistic about the future, but certainly we've got a long way to go.
Recently there have been problems between India and US regarding the Kashmir issue. I was wondering what kind of opinion you have on that problem.
I think we'll have to have another session on it. I think the answer on that, as in many other, is that India and Pakistan need to work it out. And if it cannot be worked out between them, then some kind of efforts at mediation or efforts and finding some kind of settlement of that dispute in a peaceful fashion is the answer.
Can you see any correlation between the ethnic conflicts that are going on around the world and the civil strife that we're experiencing here in the United States, not only between blacks and whites, but between the American government and the Native American tribes here?
I think you put your finger on it. Not that I see any connection, because obviously intensity, the nature, the scope, they're all kinds of different. And if you're saying, is it going to happen tomorrow in this country? My answer is, I hope not. Can pluralism survive? My hope is it will. Is there a relationship between democracy and self-determination? I sincerely believe so. And I think that there is absolutely no reason, again, as I said, that self-determination and these conflicts would simply mean that there should be secession. Because seceding from a nation state needs, at least in my own thinking, a very high threshold, where there is, in the minds of these peoples, both in a subjective and objective fashion, a total deprivation of human rights. All kinds of those values, power, wealth, rectitude, intelligence, that all those, they are being deprived to certain peoples, and to me as an individual, or you as an individual, because we belong to a group that is being discriminated against. And I hope that there is enough goodwill in this country that we can avoid that. At this present time, if you had asked me a very straightforward question, direct question, do blacks have a right to secede in this country? My answer would be no. Do Hispanics have a right to secede in this country? My answer would be no. And the reason simply is that that kind of total deprivation of human rights, I don't see them. Are things okay? The answer is no. Can they be improved? The answer is yes. Are, at the present time, some ethnic groups discriminated against? Answer again is yes. Is that definitive state policy? And I think I'll have to say no. And so at this stage, at least in my framework, I did not elaborate on it. But I would permit secession under extreme circumstances. They're not here. What about the Native Americans? And here I think we do need to remedy the situation. Does the situation call for a separate country by them, for them? I don't think even they are demanding at the present time. There is need for some kind of autonomy. Autonomy has many meanings, and that is probably what is needed in the days to come.
How does the world deal with fundamentalism in its relationship to ethnic issues? We see this fundamentalism everywhere in our world, and the people you can't talk to, so how do you deal with it?